How's it, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the Lost Horns of Africa, the cameras that I used on this documentary, why I chose them, and how I rigged them out. So the reason I'm making this video today is because while filming the Lost Horns of Africa, we used a range of different Blackmagic cameras, from the Ursa Mini 4K to the 4.6K, the Ursa Mini Pro and the G2, as well as the Pocket 4K. This is because when we started the production, we ended up doing a crowdfunding and raised a whole bunch of money, and then we needed to put that money into production costs, but also some gear, because we didn't have what we needed to go off and shoot a feature documentary. So one of the big things I did was I looked for a camera that could meet a bunch of different needs that I had. The biggest one was that it needed to be heavy and sit on my shoulder. So at first I was actually looking at the original Ursa camera, but that ended up being way too big and a lot more expensive than the Ursa Mini 4K. And that's one of the big reasons that I went for the Ursa Mini 4K, was because of its price and a bunch of the features that it has. There were 2 XLR inputs on the Ursa Mini 4K, which was great because most of the time I ran a shotgun mic to the top of the camera and then a lapel to the subject that I was following around. And we did the same for interviews. We ran boom mics over the top and lapels on our subjects. So at the time that we got the Ursa Mini 4K, this camera was amazing, and it still is amazing, but at the time it was far more advanced than any camera I'd ever had. It was so much better than the original production cam that I had. So this camera took everything up to another level. And there were many pros about this camera. It had the XLR ends, it was global shutter, it shot 4K. It also had a decent dynamic range of 12 stops. And at the time, for me, that was perfect. That's all I needed. So the accessories that we kitted out the Ursa Mini 4K with was the shoulder kit, the handle, the EVF on the side, as well as an Edelkrone Focus 1. At the time, Blackmagic didn't make their amazing microphone mount, which goes on the top handle. So we ended up buying a Rode mic mount, which we put the NTG2 with a really short XLR onto the back into the XLR ports. And this was a great setup for us. I really didn't want a camera that had many things hanging off of it, cables dangling. It needed to work after I set it up. I needed to be able to pick it up, put it on my shoulder, slap it on a tripod, and be able to change between the two seamlessly. With the Blackmagic shoulder mount, it uses a VCT plate which goes onto your tripod, which means you have a really quick release. So you push the red tab, lift your tripod off, put it on your shoulder, run and gun, bring it back, slap it back on that VCT plate, and you're good to go with tripod shots. This setup at the time was great. It's the camera we used for the first year of shooting the documentary. A lot of the scenes that are in the film are shot in the Ursa Mini 4K. It really did its job, it did what we needed it to do, and it was a great camera for what we used it for.
Come, Baba. We're here for you. Come. Come, Baba. We're here. We're here to help you.
What it didn't have was internal NDs, and it was pretty bad in low light. So yes, the Ursa Mini 4K has got a few limitations, but what I ended up doing for the Lost Horns of Africa is when we did get the Ursa Mini 4K, I went out and shot a small promo video for my fiance's mum, and she was doing a conservation piece in the Whitsundays, which was targeting a large area that was going to be turned into a new marina. And this at the time was not going to happen. It was just going to be an ecological disaster. So we went out with the camera and shot this video and basically did a test run for the documentary. And we ended up shooting a bunch of great footage, which also gave me an idea of how this camera reacts to low light, middle of the days, as well as run and gun interviews. So testing your camera before you go out into the field is essential. Create little projects on the side just so you get familiar with your rig, with your camera, and what its capabilities are and what its limitations are. You need to take your camera and work within those limitations. Don't go out thinking it's something that it's not. Figure out what the camera can do and then work within those bounds to create the best project you can. So after about a year of filming with the Ursa Mini 4K, my fiance filmed a cell phone video, which was of me with the tripod and the Ursa Mini 4K, my low pro backpack, scratching one of the large rhinos at Care for Wild. Her name was Luna. And we posted this video on YouTube and we didn't think much of it, but a few weeks later, the video ended up doing nearly 1 million views on that channel. Blackmagic saw this and they saw that a bunch of news articles that came out were written about the Ursa Mini 4K and the documentary that we were filming. So they ended up contacting us and saying, hey, are you guys ever going to be in England? If you are, come and see us. So we stopped over in England before heading to Ireland to film at the Natural History Museum. And we climbed on a train and took a long 3-hour trip all the way to Knutsford.
So at the moment, we're walking outside of some Knutsford Shire.
We dragged our backpacks and our cameras and every bit of gear that we had to a small motel.
Walking on this little road, it's pretty busy and it's pretty fucking cold. Okay, so we've made it to the hotel. Carrying about 35 to 40 kilograms of weight on my back and on front of me, so 2.2 kilograms ends up being a long way.
2.2 kilometers.
What did I say?
2.2 kilograms.
Sorry, 2.2 kilometers, I'm very tired, that's how far we walked. We made it.
And the next day we waited in the parking lot of the hotel with all our stuff and we climbed into a vehicle and arrived at Blackmagic's branch in Knutsford. So at this meeting with Blackmagic, they said to us, would you like to try out the Ursa Mini 4.6K? And I said to them, of course, I'd love to try the Ursa Mini 4.6K. So they unboxed the camera there in front of us, put it on my shoulder and said, well, you guys can take this back with you to carry on filming your documentary. And we went, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And they ended up keeping the Ursa Mini 4K just for a service. And later on when they contacted us and they opened up everything, they said that we managed to get dust in places that they never thought were possible. And I'm pretty sure that's because we put this camera under helicopters. So the first time I got to test the 4.6K was on the shoot in the museum in Ireland.
Animals from Africa amongst the most stupendous exhibits in the building, including this wonderful black rhinoceros.
So it was amazing to put this camera on and shoot in this building because what I'd noticed first off was the dynamic range change. It was night and day from the 4K. It was so completely different that it gave me a range of different options that I could now pursue in the documentary. I could film in locations that I probably wouldn't have attempted before. Having that extra dynamic range made a world of difference. It just meant that when we were dealing with highlights and shadows, I could push the camera much further than I ever pushed the 4K. So because the 4.6K still didn't have internal NDs, I kept using the matte box with the exact same setup that I had for the 4K, which still meant that I'd have to deal with NISI filters, putting them in, running, changing them. And at the time, what I ended up doing was Morgan, my fiance, would keep the ND filters in her pouch, so we'd swap out to different levels of ND as the scenario changed, which looking back is pretty crazy.
Shake ook in the middle. Hij zegt, ga recht mannen. 1, 2, 3.
Op 3 lucht ons er aan 1 kijk. 2, 3.
When the Ursa Mini Pro came along, this ended up being a huge game changer. Having a new layout where I could access many more of the features on the outside of the camera, the internal NDs with a little twisty dial on the side of the camera. Once you get used to the layout and all the features, it becomes really intuitive as to where you need to switch your ISO, your shutter speed, and even a high frame rate button that you can just push and preset to a certain frame rate that you want to jump to. So filming slow-mo became a push of a button. This became amazing for wildlife filmmaking because you could jump to certain settings that you needed to without making too much noise. Because often when you need to hit menu buttons, you end up moving your body, bumping grass, moving your feet. So all you want when you're doing documentary filmmaking, especially wildlife, is to have something that changes at the touch of a button. Let's say you're changing your shutter speed, your ISO, your white balance, your high frame rate settings. You want that there at the touch of a button because you're going to make the least amount of noise in the quickest amount of time. And when you're filming wildlife, that is the key. Be quiet, be still, be calm, and change your settings without interrupting the wildlife or making a noise. As amazing as the Ursa Mini Pro was, it did have a fairly large downside, and this was a downside that only came with certain cameras, and we were unlucky enough to get one of those cameras. And this was that it had a major flare issue on top of the frame. As the sun hit a certain part of the sensor, a giant green flare would just pop up on top. But luckily enough, later on, Blackmagic came up with a solution. They provided these small bits of paper that were shaped over your sensor that cut off the portion that wasn't being used and stopped and eliminated the flare coming up and being a problem. So the Ursa Mini Pro also had a much cleaner image at higher ISOs. We could run ISO 800 in low light situations and not need to worry about having too much fixed pattern noise, if any. I didn't really see much at all. This was essential because one of the big moments in our film was when Sean and I went and we filmed a police raid of some alleged kingpins. I had a bulletproof vest, balaclava, and my trusty Ursa Mini Pro on my shoulder.
There, it's rolling. Okay, perfect.
We've waited for a while. We didn't know how it was going to work out, but it looks like everything might go according to plan.
It's 5 okay.
And I needed to be able to run and gun with these guys and follow them in their armored vehicles. I needed to have full flexibility. And I ran with the 18 to 35 so I could get really wide and just close enough that would work. This camera was pushed to the limits in those situations because we were in low light cabins of these armored vehicles and the bright sun on the outside. So I needed to have a good dynamic range to be able to capture these guys inside and also not blow out every single window and lose all the detail. And having this sort of dynamic range, which I think ended up being about 15 stops, maybe 14 usable, was great because it was something that I never had with the Ursa Mini 4K. If I was in that situation, I'd have to pick one or the other. So having this option was a great addition because I was able to capture things that I was never able to capture before. And finally, near the end of the shoot, we got our hands on the G2 and the Pocket 4K. Both these cameras ended up being used only a few times in the film. So I think I can say with some confidence that the Ursa Mini range of cameras is ideal for documentary filmmaking. You just need to know its limitations, you need to know how to push those limitations to the edge, you need to go in and use these cameras to their strengths. So my advice is to take whatever camera you have and master that camera. Because when it comes to documentary filmmaking, you are going to get into many situations that will only happen once. And you need to know that camera in and out so that you can capture that moment and capture it well. You could take any camera and deliver a great story with good images. You just need to master that camera and not have the camera control you. So I hope everyone enjoyed going on this little journey with me on which cameras I used for our film, why I used them, and also how I maximized their capabilities to deliver images that were good enough for cinema screens and for festivals. Thanks again for watching, guys. See you next time.